More on ASEAN, I'm joined by James Ray. He's a political science professor at California State University, Sacramento, and the director of Asian Studies. Thank you very much for joining us. ASEAN nations, they're meeting with China, the Chinese delegation today. What are you expecting them to talk about? Is it all going to be focused on trade?
Well, I think the finalization of the RCEP that China initiated, as the reporter mentioned, is really very significant. And if India goes ahead and signs on during this weekend, I think that will be a major achievement. South China Sea, they may talk about other investment platforms, but I think trade and fortifying the relationships China has in Southeast Asia with key countries like Malaysia and Indonesia will be, and as was mentioned, without the U.S. presence to backstop India or encourage its interests through the Southeast Asian partners, I think this looks like a big victory and achievement for China's diplomacy.
Certainly a lot of these ASEAN nations have been suffering quite a bit because of this trade war. They tend to be export-dependent nations. Do you think that signing this RCEP deal could relieve some of that pain?
I think so. There was a fear from the perspective of China that the U.S. was pushing companies into Southeast Asia and might give preferential access to the American countries like Vietnam, but instead the U.S. placed tariffs on a whole range of countries like India and Vietnam. And so I think those countries know China's the primary investment driver in the region and are uncertain how much American diplomatic and military support will be coming when the U.S. has now chosen for 2 straight years to not attend these key summits located in Asia.
It's kind of interesting that they're not attending, or they're sending a low-level delegation, because Washington actually released the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy Report in June, and in that document, it said that the Indo-Pacific region is the single most consequential region for America's future. So what has changed in the last 6 months?
Well, as we know, over the last 2 to 3 years, President Trump has signaled his free trade and destroyed the nascent Trans-Pacific Partnership that would have given the U.S. leverage and was really the counterweight to China's interests in the region. President Trump signaled more of a security framework by labeling the region Indo-Pacific, but I think he's really caught up in domestic politics in Washington. And then secondly, I think he wants to make a quick trade deal with China and get whatever small concessions he can gain and then move forward with that politically into the 2020 election. And that is primarily driving this interest in Asia is simply a trade deal with China, not really long-term multilateral institutional building.
And we touched upon this a little bit already, but it's sort of these questions swirling over whether India is going to make it to the finish line. It is the 3rd largest economy of the group. Can the deal afford to go on without India?
Well, I think it would be difficult without India. And India, of course, does sort of have the same supply chain scale as China and try to attract those kind of textile industries and basic material goods and heavy industry. And so I think there is a legitimate concern that India could be overrun by Chinese goods. I think it also reflects India's diplomatic ties to the United States. But without America there to really lobby for India, one of only 16 countries that's still the holdout, and I think ultimately they will probably move forward and join the RCEP, and we'll see greater integration in the Asia region, and of course the U.S. is then somewhat left out.
Yeah, certainly trade, economics, those are the things that are dominating the conversation. But what else do you expect to be discussed? Because there are a lot of outstanding issues, not least of which are the South China Sea tensions.
Well, that's the challenge for China, and that's largely why Southeast Asian countries want to buffet this relationship and encourage Chinese economic integration, but also manage the American military role. And if the U.S. isn't going to be a key player in these organizations, I think those countries will not want to ruffle feathers on the South China Sea, and countries like the Philippines and Vietnam will have the military backing of the United States to try to press their island claims. And I think that they'll have to really accept China's regional emphasis on its forward position into the South China Sea and its island chain.
All right, thank you so much, James, reporter, State University, Sacramento.